It is 11:40 p.m. and you are tuned to the frequency that keeps the night alive. Tonight's Midnight Sleep broadcast is the last signal from Yamato, a single-narrator naval war story inspired by the final days of the most famous battleship of the Second World War and the mystery surrounding a signal that may never have been fully explained. So stay with Night Shift Radio. And before we begin, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Please don't forget to support the channel through the Buy Me a Coffee link below. Every coffee helps keep the broadcast alive. And now, I'll leave you with tonight's broadcast.
In the autumn of 1991, a records clerk at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, opened a gray steel box that had not been touched since 1958. Inside were intercept logs from the Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific, pages of 5-letter code groups, frequency notations, and the terse shorthand of men who had spent the war listening to a language they were forbidden to understand until they had broken it open like a locked door. Most of the box was unremarkable, but one page, dated the 7th of April, 1945, and stamped in 3 places with classifications that no longer meant anything to anyone alive, carried a single handwritten annotation in the margin that the clerk read 4 times before she understood why it unsettled her. Source unconfirmed. Time does not reconcile. Recommend no further action. The transmission in question had been logged at 14:52 hours Tokyo time, on a frequency rarely used by Imperial Japanese Navy fleet units, in a pattern that matched no known cipher system. Not the naval code the Americans called JN-25, not the simplified flag and lamp signals used by destroyer escorts, not even the crude substitution ciphers sometimes used by merchant skippers, too far from a proper code room. It was brief. It was directional, traced by 2 listening stations to a position in the East China Sea, southwest of Kyushu. And according to every surviving record of the battle that had been fought in those waters that afternoon, it should not have existed at all, because by 14:52 hours, the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, the pride and the coffin of an empire, had already rolled onto her side, taken on the sea, through a hull torn open in more than a dozen places, and detonated with a flash and a column of black smoke that men 60 miles away mistook for a new volcano rising out of the water. So the question the clerk could not shake, and the question naval historians have quietened but never quite answered since, is the one this story exists to address. Was Yamato truly alone in her final hour, or did someone survive the explosion long enough to send one last fragment into the air? What was that signal? Who transmitted it, and why, when the war ended and the archives of 2 empires were laid open to scholars, did no official report ever explain it? Naval intelligence on both sides of the Pacific examined the timing, the frequency, the bearing, and quietly closed the file. What follows is the story behind that silence. The story the report could never tell, because the men and women who actually understood it had decided, for reasons of their own, that some truths were not the Navy's to keep. It begins, as so much of that war did, with a tank of fuel. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had perhaps enough bunker oil left in its reserves to move its great ships once more, and only once. The decision of how to spend that fuel was debated for 3 days in Tokyo among men who already understood. in the careful, unspoken way of officers trained never to say a defeat aloud, that the war in the Pacific was lost. Okinawa had been invaded on the 1st of April. American transports lay offshore by the hundreds, feeding men and steel onto the beaches at a rate Japan could not hope to match. The plan that emerged from those 3 days, Operation Tengo, asked the battleship Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers to sail south with fuel enough for one leg of one voyage, fight whatever stood in their path, and if they reached Okinawa, run the great ship aground on the beach itself, where her 18-inch guns could fire into the invasion fleet until she had nothing left to fire, and the crew who survived that long could disembark and fight on land as infantry. There was no plan and no fuel for the return trip. Every officer who signed the order understood this. Most of the 8,000 men who would sail under it were never told in so many words, though by the second week of the war's last spring, very few of them needed to be told anything plainly to understand it. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kenji Hayashi learned of the mission's true nature not from a briefing, but from the face of his division chief, an old radio man named Honda, who had served in the Imperial Navy since before Kenji was born, and who came down the passageway outside the forward radio room on the evening of the 5th of April, with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to let his hands shake. "We sail tomorrow," Honda said, and nothing else, and Kenji understood from the way the old man said it, the way he did not ask Kenji to sit, did not offer the customary cup of tea, did not meet his eyes for longer than a second, that this was not an ordinary sortie. Kenji was 23 years old, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of careful handwriting that had gotten him noticed at the communication school in Yokosuka 2 years earlier, and assigned, eventually, to the flagship of the combined fleet, a posting that had filled his mother with a pride she expressed only by writing him longer letters than usual, and his father, a school teacher in Hiroshima, with quiet opinions about the war that he had stopped voicing aloud sometime around 1943, with something closer to dread. Kenji had a sister, Aiko, 2 years younger, sharper than he was at mathematics, and at the particular discipline of pattern that made for a good code clerk. And it was a quiet sorrow of his life that the Navy had found uses for her mind that kept her 300 miles away from him for the better part of 2 years, at a coastal listening station above Kanoya in southern Kyushu, monitoring frequencies and logging traffic that she was forbidden, under threat of court-martial, from discussing even with her own brother. They had found a way around that prohibition years before either of them wore a uniform. As children in Hiroshima, bored through long summers while their father graded papers at the kitchen table, Kenji and Aiko had invented a private code built from a poem their mother used to recite to them before bed. A simple substitution, each syllable of the poem mapped to a number, the numbers strung together into messages that meant nothing to anyone who did not know the poem by heart. It was a child's cipher, breakable in an afternoon by anyone with training. But it had a particular property that made it useful in 1945. It belonged to no naval code book, appeared in no intercept manual, and existed nowhere on paper, because neither of them had ever written it down. It lived only in memory, in a song about cherry blossoms in a river and a promise to return in spring. And it had carried over 2 years of war. A handful of small and forbidden messages arrived safely, thinking of you. Happy birthday. Slipped past censors who had no way of recognizing a code they did not know was a code. Kenji had used it twice since being assigned to Yamato. He told himself each time that it was harmless, a brother reassuring a sister, nothing that touched the war at all. He did not yet know how much weight that small, private channel would be asked to carry before the spring was finished 300 miles north of where Yamato lay at anchor in Tokuyama Bay, in a concrete listening post cut into a hillside above the airfields at Kanoya. Aiko Hayashi sat at a headset and a logbook on the night of the 5th of April and felt, without being able to say why, that something in the traffic crossing her station had changed. Fleet movement orders had a particular texture, a density of repeated call signs and priority markings that any experienced operator learned to recognize the way a sailor learns to read weather in the color of the sky before a storm reaches him. She did not know that night that her brother's ship was the subject of the orders crossing her headset. She knew only that the volume of coded traffic moving between Kure, Tokuyama, and the fleet had the weight of something final in it, and she found herself, for no reason she could have defended to her superior officer, writing Kenji's name in the margin of her own logbook and then crossing it out before anyone could see. In Tokyo, in a building near the Navy Ministry that most of the city did not know existed, Commander Saburo Mizuno had spent 11 months chasing a problem that refused to resolve. 3 times in the past year, American carrier strikes had arrived at fleet anchorages with a precision that defied coincidence. Not the broad probability of good reconnaissance, but the specific surgical foreknowledge of men who already knew what they would find before they flew. Mizuno's section had been asked, quietly and without much hope of success, to determine whether the leak was a broken cipher, a captured code book, or a man. He had spent 11 months without an answer, and the not knowing had worn a particular groove into him, the kind of grinding patience that intelligence work demanded and which left, in men like Mizuno, very little room left over for anything else. Not family, which he had none of since his wife's death in the firebombing of Tokyo the previous March. Not sleep, which came to him now only in short, suspicious intervals. When word reached his desk on the 5th of April that the fleet was sailing on a mission of unusual scale and unusual secrecy, his first instinct was not pride or grief, but a kind of cold, professional alarm. If there was a leak, this was the operation it would surface on, because this was the operation that mattered most. He requested, and was granted, direct access to the fleet's communications logs for the duration of the sortie. It was a request that would matter a great deal more than he understood when he made it. Yamato sailed from Tokuyama at 4 in the morning on the 6th of April, 1945, in the gray hour before dawn, when the water of the inland sea lay flat and silvered and gave back no reflection at all, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. She was the largest battleship ever built, 263 meters of armored steel, her main guns capable of throwing a shell the weight of a small automobile over 25 miles. And she moved out of the bay that morning at the head of a small, defiant column. The cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. Every ship loaded with fuel enough for one direction and ammunition enough, perhaps, for one real fight. There had been a ceremony on the dock the evening before. Sake passed among the crew, words spoken by officers about honor and the defense of the homeland that some men believed and some men repeated because the alternative was to say nothing at all. Kenji had stood near the rail with his friend since the academy, an ensign named Tamura, who served in the gunnery division and who had, in the strange, easy way young men make each other laugh, even at the edge of catastrophe, spent most of the ceremony making quiet jokes about the quality of the sake until Kenji could no longer keep his face straight, and the chief master-at-arms had glared at both of them, and for a moment it had almost felt like an ordinary night. It did not feel like an ordinary night by the time the ship reached the Bungo Strait, the narrow channel between Kyushu and Shikoku that funneled every fleet movement out of the inland sea into the open Pacific, and that every Japanese commander knew, with the resigned certainty of long experience, was watched. American submarines patrolled those waters the way wolves patrol a deer trail, not because they could see through the strait's currents and headlands, but because they did not need to. They needed only to wait at the mouth of the funnel for whatever came through it. The submarine USS Threadfin had been on, stationed at the southern approach to the strait. For 6 days, when her sound operator picked up the first distant thrum of multiple heavy screws just after sunset on the 6th of April, her captain, a lean, quiet Texan named Lieutenant Commander Walter Briggs, who had commanded submarines since before Pearl Harbor and had learned in that time to trust the particular stillness that came over a boat in the seconds before its crew understood they had found something worth dying for, brought the boat to periscope depth in the failing light and watched a column of warships pass less than 9,000 yards away, silhouetted against the last gray color in the western sky. He did not need binoculars or a recognition manual to know what he was looking at. No other ship in the Imperial Navy had that silhouette. The towering pagoda mast, the immense flat run of deck, the sheer scale of her dwarfing the destroyers around her into the look of tugboats escorting a mountain. Briggs felt, watching her pass, something that surprised him afterward when he tried to put it into words for his log. Not triumph, not even excitement, but a kind of held breath, the way a man feels watching something enormous and doomed move past him in the dark, indifferent to his presence, unaware that its course had already been altered by the simple fact of having been seen. He surfaced as soon as the column had cleared the strait and the night had thickened enough to hide the boat's silhouette, and sent the contact report himself, standing at the radio shack door reading the position, course, and composition of the Japanese force to his communications officer in a voice that he kept deliberately flat because the men around him took their cues for how frightened to be from how frightened he sounded, and he had long ago decided that the job required him to sound like nothing frightened him at all. 40 minutes later, the submarine Hackleback, patrolling 30 miles to the south, picked up the same column and sent a second report that confirmed the first. By midnight, the contact had been relayed through Pearl Harbor to the carrier task force steaming 200 miles to the southeast, and by 1 in the morning, search aircraft were being readied on 4 different flight decks for a dawn launch that would not, in the end, even be necessary, because the Japanese force held a course and a speed that made its destination almost unmistakable to any staff officer who had studied a chart of the southern approaches to Okinawa. Briggs did not know any of that yet. He knew only that he had sighted the largest warship in the world, reported her, and that his own boat now had nothing left to do but watch the night close back over the strait and wait to learn, like everyone else, how the morning would end. Lieutenant Ruth Calloway received the contact reports at the fleet radio unit's forward listening station shortly after 2 in the morning, Pacific time, in a Quonset hut that smelled permanently of damp paper and cigarette smoke, where she had spent the better part of 3 years listening to a Navy-speaking numbers. She had been trained slowly and with great difficulty to understand. She was 26, from a small town in Ohio that she had not seen in 2 years, with a talent for pattern recognition that had gotten her recruited out of a mathematics degree she had never finished and into a unit whose existence she had been instructed never to acknowledge to her own parents. The submarine sighting reports did not surprise her. Fleet movements out of the inland sea had been expected for days, ever since traffic analysis showed an unusual concentration of fueling orders moving through the Kura Naval District, but something in the volume and pattern of Japanese fleet communications that night caught her attention in a way that made her stay at her console an hour past the end of her shift, marking frequencies on a chart that was already crowded with the previous month's annotations. She would remember much later that she had felt that night the particular unease of a person listening to a conversation in a language she understood well enough to follow the shape of, but not yet well enough to be sure she had heard correctly. The sense that something important was being said, and that she did not yet have all the pieces required to know what it was. Dawn on the 7th of April found the Japanese force 200 miles north of Okinawa, in waters where the Pacific stopped pretending to be calm. The East China Sea, in early spring, carried a particular quality of light that the men who served in those waters remembered for the rest of their lives. A flat, pewter-colored glare that made the horizon difficult to judge, and the sea and sky bleed into each other at the edges, broken only by the white scratch of wave crests under a wind that had been rising steadily since midnight. There had been a promise, before the fleet sailed, of land-based fighter cover from the airfields on Kyushu. I promised that several officers aboard Yamato had received with the particular skepticism of men who had watched too many promised reinforcements failed to materialize over the past year of the war. The promise did not materialize this time either. A handful of fighters appeared briefly over the fleet in the mid-morning hours, circled, and were gone before noon, called back, or lost to weather, or simply overwhelmed by a tactical situation no dozen aircraft could have changed. And the men on Yamato's anti-aircraft mounts understood, watching the empty sky after they left, exactly what that absence meant. The first American search aircraft found the fleet shortly after 8 in the morning, climbing high enough to stay out of effective anti-aircraft range and radioing a position report that confirmed everything the submarine sightings had suggested. By 10 o'clock, 4 fleet carriers had begun launching the first of nearly 400 aircraft. dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters flying escort and strafing runs in a strike whose scale had been calculated for one purpose only, to ensure that nothing survived the attempt to reach Okinawa, regardless of how many waves it took or how many aircraft were spent doing it. Aboard Yamato, the morning passed in the particular suspended quiet that settles over a warship that knows what is coming and cannot do anything but wait for it. Kenji spent it in the forward radio room, monitoring traffic alongside Honda and two younger ratings, the four of them crowded into a compartment that smelled of hot vacuum tubes and machine oil, the bulkheads around them thrumming faintly with the turn of the great ship's four propeller shafts. He had written a letter to his parents the night before, the kind of letter a man writes when he suspects, without quite allowing himself to say so, even on paper, that it may be his last. Careful, restrained, full of reassurances he did not entirely believe himself, ending with a line about cherry blossoms that he hoped his mother would understand without his having to explain that he meant it as a kind of goodbye. He had not written to Aiko. There had not seemed, somehow, to be words for what he wanted to say to her, and he told himself there would be time later, after, though some quieter part of him already suspected there would not be. Ensign Tamura found him during the mid-morning lull, climbing down from the gunnery director with the restless energy of a man who needed to talk to someone before the waiting became unbearable. And the two of them stood for a few minutes near the radio room hatch, saying very little of consequence. A comment about the weather, a half-remembered joke from their academy days, the kind of conversation that meant nothing and everything, because it was the last ordinary conversation either of them would have. Down in the sick bay, Surgeon Lieutenant Saito was laying out instruments and bandages in quantities that made the orderlies around him go quiet, doing the arithmetic of a man who understood, better than most aboard, exactly how many of the ship's 3,300 men he would not be able to save once the attack began. And preparing anyway, because preparing was the only mercy left to offer. At 12:32 hours, the first wave of American aircraft appeared on the horizon, climbing out of the haze in a formation that took the men watching from Yamato's deck several long seconds to understand was not a flock of birds. What followed has been described many times in many records, and most of those descriptions converge on the same essential truth, that no ship, however large, however well armed, could have survived what came next, because the calculation behind the attack had never been about whether Yamato could be sunk, but only about how long it would take and what it would cost to do it. Wave after wave of dive bombers came down out of the glare with the sun behind them, releasing at altitudes calculated to put their bombs through the lighter deck armor amidships, while torpedo bombers came in low and fast from multiple bearings at once, a tactic designed specifically to overwhelm a single ship's ability to maneuver away from torpedoes approaching from every direction simultaneously. The destroyers and the cruiser Yahagi fought as fiercely as their guns allowed, and absorbed attacks meant, in part, for the larger ship, and several of them paid for that with their own destruction before the afternoon was finished. But the weight of the American strike had been built around one target, and by 1:30, that target had already taken the first of what would eventually be counted as somewhere between 10 and 12 torpedo hits and several direct bomb hits, and had begun almost imperceptibly at first, to list. In the forward radio room, the men felt each impact as a deep shudder transmitted through the hull rather than a sound. A blow felt in the chest before it was heard, and between impacts they continued working, because there was nothing else to do, logging the chatter of damage reports moving between compartments, relaying what little remained coherent to relay. Honda kept his headset on through 3 direct hits, close enough to throw loose gear across the compartment, his hand steady on the set in a way that Kenji found, even amid his own fear, quietly extraordinary. And it was Honda who first said aloud, sometime after 2 o'clock, the sentence that every man in that compartment had already understood without anyone saying it: "We are not going to make it to Okinawa." The order to counter-flood the starboard engine and boiler rooms came down from the bridge a short while later, a decision made by the ship's damage control officer, a careful, exhausted lieutenant commander named Kurosawa, who had spent the better part of an hour watching the list increase past the point where the ship's main guns could be trained accurately, and understood that, without correcting it, Yamato would capsize within minutes rather than the hour or more her crew might otherwise have to escape. It was the correct decision by every measure of naval engineering, and it was also, in the plainest terms, an order that condemned the men working in those flooded compartments. Stokers, engineers, men Kurosawa had eaten breakfast beside that same morning, to die at their posts so that the ship might survive a little longer for everyone above them. He gave the order in a voice that did not shake, because a damage control officer's voice is not permitted to shake, and he carried the weight of having given it for whatever remained of his life, which in his case was measured afterward not in years, but in less than 40 minutes. It bought the ship time. It did not buy her survival. By a little after 2 o'clock, with both sides of the hull breached, with fires burning in 3 separate sections of the ship, with the list past 20 degrees and climbing, every officer still capable of clear thought aboard, Yamato understood that what remained was not a question of saving the ship, but of how the next several minutes would be spent. It was in those minutes, not before, not in calm water, not under any circumstance an official report would later find easy to reconstruct, that Kenji Hayashi made the decision that would outlive him. He had, for nearly a year, kept a small project hidden in a maintenance locker adjoining the radio room. A low-power emergency transmitter, salvaged piece by piece from discarded equipment and spare parts that no inventory officer had ever missed, built originally as nothing more than an idle hobby, a young radio man's private satisfaction in proving to himself that he could build a working set from scrap. He had told almost no one about it. Honda had known, had even helped him scavenge a coil from a decommissioned destroyer's spare parts bin during a refit the previous summer, and had never asked what Kenji intended to use it for, because some questions between an old chief and a young officer did not need asking. With the main radio equipment failing under the strain of repeated shock damage, and the compartment beginning to fill with smoke from a fire 2 decks below, Kenji made his way to the locker, pulled out the small set, and connected it to a battery bank that Honda, without a word, helped him drag clear of a collapsed cable run. There was no order behind what he did next. There was no military purpose to it at all, and he knew, working with hands that he was distantly surprised to find were not shaking, that every second he spent on this was a second he was not spending finding his way up through smoke-filled passageways toward whatever chance of survival remained on a deck already listing, past the angle from which a man could easily climb. He understood the trade he was making. He made it anyway. He kept the message short, because the poem cipher he and Aiko had built as children had never been designed for long transmissions, and because he did not have long. He thought, in the last clear seconds available to him for thinking, not of the war, not of the empire, not of honor in any of the large abstract senses that had been spoken of so often over the past year, but of a kitchen table in Hiroshima, and a song about cherry blossoms, and a promise two children had made each other before either of them understood what a promise might someday cost. He keyed the set, sent what he had to send, and then, because Honda was already pulling at his shoulder, because the compartment was filling faster now, because some part of him that was not yet ready to die fought for the chance anyway, he tried, with the old chief beside him, to find a way up through a passageway that the ship's increasing list had already begun to turn into something closer to a chimney than a corridor. Neither of them reached the deck at 14:23 hours, the magazines forward of Yamato's bridge. Structure detonated in an explosion that survivors described afterward in language that struggled and failed to convey its scale. A column of black smoke and flame that rose, by some estimates, over a mile into the sky, visible to ships 40 miles away, and felt as a shock wave through the water by submarines submerged 20 miles distant. The battleship broke apart and went down within minutes. Of roughly 3,300 men aboard, just over 270 survived, pulled from the water by the few destroyers still capable of stopping to look for them in seas thick with oil and wreckage, and the particular silence that follows the loss of something too large for the mind to immediately process as gone. 300 miles to the north, in the listening post above Kanoya, Aiko Hayashi was midway through a routine shift, scanning the frequencies assigned to her station, when a fragment of transmission crossed her headset at 14:22 hours that made her hand freeze above her logbook before her conscious mind had finished identifying why. It was brief, perhaps 4 seconds of signal, badly degraded, riding a frequency well outside the range normally monitored for naval traffic. And to any other operator in that room, it would have registered, if it registered at all, as nothing more than atmospheric noise or a stray civilian transmission drifting in from some unlicensed set. But the pattern beneath the noise, the particular rhythm of numbers grouped in 2s and 3s, was a pattern Aiko had heard exactly twice before in her life, both times from her brother, both times built from a poem about a river and cherry blossoms that existed nowhere but in their shared memory. She did not, in that moment, have the numbers in front of her long enough to translate them fully. The signal cut off, swallowed by static, before she had logged more than a fragment, and she would spend a great many sleepless nights in the months that followed trying to reconstruct from memory and partial notation what those few seconds had actually carried. But she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with 2 years of shared childhood, exactly whose hand had been on the key She wrote the time, the frequency, and the bearing in her logbook with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in her 2 years of service, and she did not, for reasons she could not have fully explained even to herself, mention to her superior officer that she believed she recognized the source. At the Fleet Radio Unit's listening post, Lieutenant Ruth Calloway logged what was almost certainly the same fragment of signal at 4:52 hours, her station's clock time. The discrepancy in recorded times a function of imprecise clock, synchronization between stations an ocean apart, a detail that would later cause exactly the kind of confusion the College Park clerk would find unsettling decades afterward. Calloway's direction-finding equipment placed the source within a few miles of the position where Yamato had gone down less than half an hour earlier, and the pattern of the transmission matched nothing in any cipher manual her station possessed. For 3 days afterward, she and 2 other cryptanalysts treated it as a live security concern. The possibility, however remote, of an unrecognized Japanese covert network, or worse, a system sophisticated enough that its very simplicity was a kind of camouflage. They examined it from every analytical angle their training offered. They found no answer. By the end of the week, with the larger battle for Okinawa consuming every available resource, the fragment was filed as unresolved, a single strange footnote in an ocean of far larger and more urgent traffic. And Calloway moved on to the next day's work, though she kept, in a private notebook she was not supposed to keep at all, a copy of the timing and frequency that she would still be unable to explain 40 years later, long after she had left the Navy, married, and become the kind of grandmother who told her grandchildren almost nothing about what she had done during the war. Commander Mizuno received word of Yamato's loss in Tokyo late on the evening of the 7th, along with the casualty estimates that made the room around him go very quiet. And it was 3 days before the question that had brought him to the operation in the first place, the leak, the persistent worry that something or someone had been feeding the Americans foreknowledge they should not have had, resurfaced in connection with a single irregular entry buried in the fleet's communications log, an unauthorized transmission, origin unconfirmed, timed within minutes of the ship's destruction on a frequency and pattern that matched nothing in any registered cipher. To a man who had spent 11 months hunting exactly this kind of anomaly, it read, at first glance, like exactly the kind of evidence he had been failing to find for nearly a year. Proof, perhaps, that someone aboard Yamato had been in contact with the enemy, whether under duress or by design, in the ship's final hour. He pursued it with the particular grim thoroughness of a man for whom this single question had become, over 11 exhausting months, almost the entire shape of his war. He interviewed survivors as they were processed through naval hospitals over the following weeks. Men with burned hands and salt-cracked lips, who answered his questions in the flat, distant voices of people who had not yet finished returning from wherever the explosion had sent their minds. Most knew nothing of any unauthorized transmission. One did. A young rating named Sato, pulled from the water with a fractured collarbone and a memory of the ship's final 20 minutes that he would carry, sharp and unforgiving, for the rest of his life, told Mizuno, hesitantly, glancing twice toward the door as if expecting to be stopped, that he had seen Lieutenant Hayashi and Chief Honda working at something in the maintenance locker beside the radio room in the ship's last minutes, something neither man had explained and neither man had survived to be asked about, and that he had heard, faintly through the chaos, the particular rhythmic clicking of a key being worked by hand. Mizuno followed the thread to Kenji Hayashi's service record, and from there, inevitably, to the existence of a sister stationed at a listening post above Kanoya. He traveled south himself, rather than send the inquiry through ordinary channels, a decision that surprised even him, and arrived at the station on a gray, wine-scoured morning in late April to find a young woman who had clearly not slept properly in weeks, and who, when he asked her directly whether she had intercepted or had any knowledge of an irregular transmission on the afternoon of the 7th, went very still in a way that told him, before she said a single word, everything he had traveled 300 miles to learn. She did not lie to him, not exactly. She told him about the poem, about the cipher built from it, about two children at a kitchen table in Hiroshima who had never imagined the small private language they were inventing would someday be the last words to pass between them. She did not, even then, have the full content of the message to give him. Only fragments, partially reconstructed from a memory of 4 seconds of degraded signal, enough to be confident of its source and almost nothing else. And she told him this honestly, because by that point in the conversation, watching this exhausted, grieving woman across a bare wooden table, Mizuno had already understood that whatever he found here was not going to be the espionage he had spent 11 months hunting. He sat with that understanding for a long time after she finished speaking, turning over in his mind exactly what an honest report would require him to write. A formal accounting would have to note that an officer aboard one of the Imperial Navy's most important ships had, in defiance of regulations and at the cost of his own chance of survival, built and concealed unauthorized communications equipment, and had used it in the ship's final minutes to transmit a personal message rather than render any final assistance to his own escape or to the men around him. Facts that a less generous reading might frame as a serious breach of discipline, even in the bloodless language official inquiries sometimes used about dead men. A dereliction. It would also have to identify Aiko as the recipient of an unauthorized transmission she had failed to report through proper channels. A fact that could, in the suspicious climate of a navy still hunting an unexplained pattern of intelligence leaks, expose her to consequences entirely disproportionate to what she had actually done, which was nothing more than recognize her own brother's voice in the last seconds before he died. Mizuno had spent 11 months looking for a traitor and had found, instead, 2 siblings and a children's cipher built from a poem about cherry blossoms, and the gap between what he had been hunting and what he had actually found settled into him with a weight he had not expected, he thought, sitting across that bare table from a young woman, trying very hard not to weep in front of a superior officer, of his own wife, gone now for over a year, and of how little comfort the Navy's careful, accurate accounting of her death in the firebombing had ever given him. And he made, in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, a decision that he never recorded anywhere and never spoke of again to anyone outside that room. He filed his final report on the irregular transmission as inconclusive. Equipment malfunction, possible atmospheric interference affecting a damaged emergency circuit. Source unconfirmed. Recommend no further action. Language carefully chosen to close the file without either confirming a security breach that did not exist or exposing two people whose only crime had been loving each other across the careful machinery of two empires at war. It was not strictly an honest report. He understood that and made his peace with it in whatever fashion a man in his position could make peace with anything by the spring of 1945, reasoning that the Navy's records had survived worse omissions than this one, and that some truths belonged to the people who had lived them, rather than to the file cabinets of men who had merely investigated them afterward. What he could not give Aiko, what no one could give her, that spring or for many years afterward, was the actual content of her brother's final message, because the fragment she had caught was too short, too degraded to reconstruct with confidence on her own. She carried the partial pattern of it for the rest of her life, turning it over in quiet moments, the way a person turns over a few surviving photographs of someone they loved, certain of the shape of the thing, and never quite certain of all its details. It was not until 1987, when a researcher working through newly declassified American intercept logs reached out to a small circle of surviving Japanese signal veterans in the hope of identifying an unexplained wartime anomaly, that Aiko, by then 70 years old, a retired school teacher in Hiroshima who had spent 4 decades teaching children the same poems her mother had once read to her, was shown for the first time the American station's full timing and bearing data alongside her own fragmentary record, and between the two incomplete halves found enough to finally complete what her brother had sent. It was, in the end, exactly as short and as simple as the cipher had always demanded, and it carried no military information at all, no coordinates, no warning, nothing that any intelligence service on either side of the ocean would ever have found useful. Translated from the poem's private arithmetic, it read, "Tell mother the cherry trees bloomed early this year. I kept my promise. Forgive me for not waiting for spring." Aiko sat with that sentence for a long time after she finally understood it, in a small sunlit room overlooking a city that had been rebuilt twice in her lifetime, and found that the grief it brought her was not new. She had carried some version of it for over 40 years. But that completing it, finally hearing the whole of what her brother had wanted to say rather than the broken edges of it, gave the grief a shape it had not had before, something closer to peace than to pain, though she would have struggled to explain the difference to anyone who had not waited as long as she had to hear it. She thought more than once in the years that followed of Commander Mizuno, whom she had met only that one time, and who had died of illness in 1962 without ever speaking publicly of the case he had quietly closed in the spring of 1945. She did not know until the same 1987 research project that finally gave her the full message also surfaced a handwritten note in his personal effects that he had kept folded inside his own copy of the report, a brief private record of the conversation they had had. Not an official document, never meant for any file, simply a few lines noting that he had chosen that day to let a private grief remain private. because the Navy he served had already taken enough from people who had given it everything they had to give. It was the closest thing to an apology, or perhaps a kind of absolution, that either of them ever received from the war that had taken so much from both of them. And Aiko kept the note, after she was given a copy of it, in the same drawer where she kept her brother's last letter, the one he had written to their parents the night before the ship sailed, the one with the line about cherry blossoms that her mother had read so many times over so many years that the paper had gone soft and translucent at the folds, like something held up too long against the light. The official record of the Battle of the East China Sea, as it stands in the archives of two nations to this day, still lists the irregular transmission intercepted in the minutes following Yamato's destruction as unresolved. A footnote, a curiosity, a small unanswered question in the margins of a much larger catastrophe. Naval historians who have come across it since have offered theories ranging from equipment malfunction to atmospheric anomaly to, in a few more imaginative accounts, the suggestion of some unexplained second vessel that no other record supports. None of them have been wrong exactly so much as incomplete, working as they were from the only evidence the official channels ever preserved. The truth, such as it survives at all, exists now mostly in the memory of people who are themselves nearly gone, in a poem about a river and cherry blossoms that two children once turned into a private language without imagining what it would someday be asked to carry, in the quiet mercy of an intelligence officer who decided that some questions did not need answering in the Navy's own words, in the particular stillness of a young woman's hands, the moment she recognized her brother's voice riding in on a few seconds of static 300 miles from where he died. The Pacific Ocean closed over the wreck of the great ship within minutes and has kept its silence about the rest in the patient, indifferent way the ocean keeps everything, not as a guardian of secrets exactly, but simply because it has never been the nature of the sea to explain itself to anyone, and least of all to the men and women who go down into it carrying, in the last seconds available to them, whatever truths mattered more to them than survival. If you have ever wondered, reading some brief clinical account of the battle, why a single strange entry in an old intercept log was never fully explained, you now know what naval intelligence on both sides failed, in the end, to understand. That not every signal sent in wartime is a weapon, and not every silence that follows one is a failure of investigation. Some signals are sent simply because a person, in the last minutes available to them, cannot bear the thought of leaving the people they love without one final word, however small, however impossible to send, however far it has to travel, to be heard at all. Yamato went down that afternoon with nearly everyone aboard her, and the sea took the rest of what she carried without comment, as it always does. But for 4 seconds, in the smoke and the noise and the breaking apart of the largest warship the world had ever built, one voice reached, however briefly, across 300 miles of empire and ocean and war, to land exactly where it was meant to land, in the memory of a sister who never stopped listening for it long after everyone else had decided there was nothing left to hear.